Welcome to Worldbuilding in Anime, a panel about world building in anime. Yeah, I'm Bokusachi. My Twitter handle's down there at the bottom if you want to be friends with me, and I'll be your host on this whirlwind tour of some of the amazing ways that anime worlds can tell a story all their own. Alright, so when I do this panel in person, I like to use clips to highlight specific examples of the things that I discuss. Unfortunately, I won't be doing that here to avoid running into copyright issues, but on the other hand, it means that I have more time to give you some exclusive online-only takes. Yeah. Now, anyway, I'm no expert or anything, but I have seen a lot of anime, enough to know what works for me and what doesn't, so I hope that this panel can introduce you to some new shows to enjoy, and give you some tools with which to better understand what you like most in an anime world, and what makes your favorite anime's world so special to you. We're going to start off with a very general overview of world building and why it's so important. Then we'll move on to talk about how anime uses settings, like the time and the place and the rules that hold things together. After settings, we'll see how anime populates its world with creatures, people, and culture. And finally, we'll see how all this comes together with the technical side of the show to create an atmosphere, and how it really gets you to breathe that world's air. So, the general overview. Why does world building matter? Why can't I just watch my cute girl cartoons in peace, man? Well, whether you notice it or not, every anime has a world. From the most epic high fantasy to the most mundane slice of life series. Even something like a high school setting that seems boring and lazy is chosen for a reason and carries its own implications. Like a high school setting is familiar, it's nostalgic, it gives the characters an excuse to run into each other frequently, and anime characters are usually teenagers, so if they're in school, the writer doesn't have to hand-wave away why they're not there. So yeah, basically every anime has a world, but a good world is more than just like an exquisitely painted background or a big world map or lots of supporting characters or an intricate combat system. Like, those are all good things, but an anime can have all those things and still not have a great world. And an anime can also have a great world without any of those things. It's all about what the story needs. It's how the elements of the world are used to frame the show that makes all the difference. A great world to me is one that is able to immerse you in the mindset of the show, to make you believe in it, to make it feel real. A great world puts the story into context. It can drive the plot of a show by setting the stage for conflicts, or it can emphasize its themes by raising intriguing questions. It can help you relate with the characters by giving you an understanding of what it's like to live in their world with them, or it can keep you coming back again and again by just creating a place that you want to spend time in, a place you want to experience and learn more about. A great world feels alive. It feels lived in. It provides a foundation on which the rest of the story can be built. It's at the same time larger than the story and inseparable from it. And by that I mean its inhabitants have lives outside of the story, but the story is one that couldn't be told as effectively anywhere else. It doesn't just seem real, it's better than real. It takes what makes the world unique and distills it down to a purer essence of itself than reality could ever offer. A great world is full of enriching details. More than just trivia and references, these are details that hint at the type of lives its characters lead, the type of thematic material the show will deal with, the type of contextualizing events that took place in its past or that may come in its future. But at the same time, it doesn't need to show you everything that there is to know, because sometimes what goes unseen can be just as powerful as what you do see. So to me, good world building is the difference between like knowing things about the world and feeling like a part of it. Alright, so when you think of world building, the first thing you probably think of is the setting, so let's start there. The setting, of course, is the time and the place in which the events of the story happen, and there are plenty of different forms it can take. An anime can take place in the past, present, or future of a real place, an imaginary place, or somewhere in between. As I alluded to in my introduction, one of the most common anime settings is high school. It's a useful shorthand that pretty universally sets up a basic set of expectations. Like, we all know what gym class is, right? And it also brings to mind this time in your life that was full of change and self-discovery. High school settings are also everywhere, which does make them understandably easy to get sick of, but it does make them useful for looking at how changing some of the details of a very basic setting can have a huge effect on the show as a whole. For example, is the school the focus of the setting, or is it used as a mundane contrast to a more fantastical world? Do the characters spend their time in class, or in festivals and field trips, or doing club activities? Is the school framed as a place for love to bloom? Or is it overrun by the characters' imaginations? Or is it just naturally super weird? Is it exclusive and prestigious? Or is it some, like, poor countryside school out in the middle of nowhere? What do they learn there? Do they learn magic? Do they learn how to be superheroes? Or maybe even some deeper questions, like, do the characters feel safe there? How much power does the student council have? You know, things like that. Is there a giant robot in the basement? Does it pit the students against each other in a huge battle tournament? Is it just straight up haunted? Is it even actually a school, or just a bizarre playground for compulsive high-stakes gambling addicts? Yeah, I guess the point here is, the big takeaway is that even a setting as simple as high school has a lot of ways to set itself apart. And looking at the way it uses that setting can reveal a lot about the show and help you appreciate it in a new way. In other words, a show's setting will always have implications for, like, the plot and the characters, and can often raise interesting questions that either drive the story or support it thematically. A show that uses its setting effectively understands what those implications are and how to use them to immerse you in the desired experience. We already looked at the breadth that can be covered with a single setting like high school, so let's look at some of the deeper implications of a more unusual one. How about Space Brothers, a show that features astronauts walking on the surface of the moon? That's a little different from high school, right? So the moon is a pretty hostile environment. It sure ain't no high school. There's no breathable air, there's no naturally occurring food or water, the featureless landscape makes it easy to unknowingly fall into a crater. Like, the whole time you're there, you're depending on specially developed technology just to keep you alive and in communication with civilization. There's only so much time you can spend outside, only so far you can explore, only so long you can spend on the moon at all before you run out of supplies. But even coming home is a long and dangerous trip. And Space Brothers is just amazing in how it finds so many ways to weave these implications into its story. Like, you've got training arcs specifically for, like, training for low oxygen, low gravity environments. You've got this, like, looming backstory about a failed return voyage and how, what if that happens to the brother who's on the moon? Or you actually have a sudden accident that happens on the moon, and it's so far away from any help that, like, what are they going to do? And even when these things are resolved, you still have the, like, engineering solutions to these problems that cause the accidents and trying to come up with ideas to fix them. Or you have, like, the trauma and loss that the characters are dealing with as a result. And this show, man, this show's got it all. So yeah, anime's nature as a drawn medium gives it so much power to tailor a setting precisely to its story like this. There's no need to construct, like, sets or costumes, because you can just draw them. And so this opens up so many possibilities that would be impractical otherwise. Some anime choose to go all in on this and build up a fantastical location that's so much larger than life that it can almost be considered a character in and of itself. It can become a massive centerpiece for a key moment or set the stage for the entire show just by being there. This can be seen in one of the anime that most directly inspired this panel, Made in Abyss. Everything about this show is centered around this giant hole in the ground, like the abyss, and there's a whole city literally like centered around it. A whole culture built around diving into the abyss for materials or for experimentation or for even just to see what's down there, to map the place out. And the abyss is made up of layers upon layers, and each one of them is more deadly and alien than the last. And each one of them also has a harsher price to pay to return to the one above it. Like the deeper you dive, it seems like, the more forcibly it pulls you in. The abyss is essentially the call to adventure made manifest. It raises these burning questions, not just in the characters, but also in us, the audience. Like, what is waiting to be discovered just a little bit farther into these depths? And do we have what it takes to get there? Like these wonders, these horrors, these mysteries, the danger of it all, and yet the necessity of taking this plunge with no hope of return. That forms the core of what makes the show what it is. The Abyss is a setting so powerful that it single-handedly drives the show forward. For another example of a setting with strong thematic weight, Nausicaa reinforces its message about the power of nature with enormous rainforests, barren deserts, like these toxic jungles and treacherous storm clouds and all these other huge natural occurrences that make the humans and their conflicts seem just so small by the sheer scale of them. And the protection offered to like the Valley of the Wind by the towering mountains, like for example, that's things like that emphasize one of the main themes of the movie. The theme that humanity is best served by embracing nature rather than trying to combat and dominate it. But yeah, this kind of show-defining setting isn't always geographical, though. It could, like, for example, Aria, the animation, has one that's architectural. Aria's vision of a colonized Mars is heavily inspired by Venice, with canals full of calm water and gently paddled gondolas instead of bustling streets full of cars. And this feature of the setting lets both the show and the viewer like slow down and relax and take it easy and just soak in the beauty of this city on the water. Of course, not all anime worlds are created from whole cloth like this. Plenty of anime are set in an actual real place as well, and creators use a number of techniques to try and capture these places in animation. One simple way is to choose a place that they already know quite well, like Tokyo. Much like with the high school setting, what will make these sorts of places stand out is what the creators choose to emphasize about the place, the things that are important to them about it. Maybe the focus will be on a particular neighborhood or time of year or a particular aspect of the city. Like 5 centimeters per second, for example. It weaves its bittersweet romantic tale through the lens of things like cherry blossoms and trains that are like very intimately familiar to the people of Tokyo and bring to mind these very specific times, these very specific events and feelings. But for a setting that's less intimately familiar, there's research to be done. Looking up reference photos, identifying important landmarks, learning about the history, the cultural events, the key industries of the area, generally, stuff like that. Getting an idea of what everyday life is like there. There are some studios like PA Works that actually like work with the local tourism department or government or whatever in a featured location to get an idea of what makes a place special to the people who live and visit there, which results in the sort of cozy small town feel that features so prominently in shows like Hanasaku Iroha and Sakura Quest. But sometimes there's just nothing like being there to experience it for yourself. When working on Heidi Girl of the Alps back in the 70s, Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata were among the first anime creators to travel across the world for location scouting. And this is sort of carried on throughout the course of Ghibli's tenure. So like in an interview for his new movie, Mary and the Witch's Flower, former Ghibli director Hiromasa Yonebayashi said that his many years of working with Miyazaki and Takahata had inspired him to do the same sort of location scouting for his new movie, which was set in rural England. So instead of using just reference pictures for Mary and the Witch's Flower, he actually went out to visit a small English town out in the countryside because he saw how it let him capture the feel of a place rather than just what it looks like. Or you could just take the riding bean approach and make one of the coolest action set pieces in anime, a car chase under the L train in Chicago, by watching the Blues Brothers a few too many times. But it's not just the place that matters when creating a setting. The when is just as important as the where. Rose of Versailles is a series that's set during pre-revolutionary France, which immediately sets it apart from other anime with its unique subject matter, but more than that, the time period serves to support the story's character arc and thematic conflicts. Like, the show is centered around Oscar's search for an identity for herself, and the show uses that ticking time bomb of the impending French Revolution to sort of to force her hand and make her choose what's most important for her to fight for. And that choice ends up being a very important part of resolving that struggle to find her identity. Planetes takes things sort of in the other direction. Instead of looking to the past, it draws on its near future setting to imagine a new type of profession, a space debris hauler. See, the problem with space debris is that even like a single loose bolt floating around in the atmosphere has to be traveling at an extremely high velocity to remain in orbit, meaning that it can do really significant damage if it collides with something, which would of course then create more debris that would just exponentially continue the cycle and keep running into and breaking things. Even littering is more advanced in the future. Isn't that great? So yeah, as we follow debris section, who are essentially space trash collectors, we see how mundane a job being an astronaut is in this future, no matter how exceptional it may seem to us today. And we see how they're subject to the same sorts of bureaucracy and like unjust stigma that as manual laborers are today, as like blue-collar workers are today. And practical details like the way that all their suits are one size fits all to save money and things like that, really, these sorts of like technical details really drive home just that just getting to space isn't enough to change the way that our world is structured. Like, through this lens, Planetes is able to transport you into a vision of the future that seems plausible and tangible and grounded in the real world conditions faced by similar professions today, which makes it that much more relevant to our current moment. An anime doesn't have to limit itself to one setting, though. A combination of multiple settings can also be used to great effect. Each episode of Flip Flappers takes our main characters to a different world drawn directly from their imaginations and the imaginations of the people around them. Each of these imagination worlds is, of course, a beautiful dreamscape that takes both them and the viewers on just this wild ride through an actual physical manifestation of like the characters developing feelings for each other. And it immerses you so deeply in their emotions by immersing you in these worlds, because in Flip Flappers, the worlds are their emotions. It's so cool. So, whereas Flip Flappers' setting sort of encompasses multiple places, Showa Genroku Rakugo Shinju is a show that features a setting across multiple time periods. Each of its 2 seasons follows its cast of stage performers across a different era of Japanese history, using like period suggestive elements such as styles of dress and forms of entertainment and customs and values to show the change that the passage of time has had on these characters and the world that they live in. The decision to split the seasons across 2 different eras also gives Yakumo, our main character, an arc that spans decades. We've not just seen, but we've experienced where he came from, what he's been through, and we're watching the world move past him. So when he takes on a new student in his old age, one whose experience is emblematic of a very different Japan than the one that he grew up in, it's sort of like a pre-war versus post-war Japan comparison. Not only are the personal stakes so much more tangible because we've spent so much time with the character, but they also sort of serve as this bridge across generations. All right, so a bit of a hard left from that last one, but Gurren Lagann is another show that is just defined by the changes in its setting. So it's a show about refusing to be bound by any limitations whatsoever, up to and including the laws of physics. So each new stage of the plot is introduced by the characters breaking through the limits of the world that they know and into like a new upper layer, another stage of the world. So like they start out in this underground bunker, and then they break through to the overworld above, and then from the overworld they break out into space, and then from space they break out into infinity and beyond, I guess. And just that moment when they break through to the surface, for all the hot blood and screaming and robot fights that make Gurren Lagann so much fun, the moment when that raw intensity just reaches its peak and gives way to this vast, open expanse, this serene moment of awestruck quiet as they gaze upon this world of more like expansive beauty and possibility than they could ever have possibly conceived of. That's really what the show's all about. Speaking of breaking the rules, the most interesting implications of a setting often come from the rules that govern how the world works. Whether they be man-made rules, physical ones, supernatural ones. We've seen a few of these come up in earlier examples, but I want to dig deeper into this idea. In many cases, these rules of a world can almost write a story on their own. Like, just look at our world and the popularity of sports and the entire industry dedicated to building narratives around them. There's, of course, a parallel for this in anime. Obviously, sports anime tend to center themselves around the rules of their respective sports. So you get things like the drama and characterization arising naturally from the roles and the matchups and the strategies and the teamwork that are inherent to the rules of these games. Though sometimes they'll bend the real life rules of the sport or exaggerate certain character traits and abilities a little bit to place some more emphasis on a specific aspect of the game or of the character's abilities or whatever. And that's how you end up with shows like Kuroko's Basketball or Prince of Tennis, where like the kids all basically have superpowers, but they're applied to basketball instead of Dragon Ball. So with how most sports work, you typically see this result in themes of like teamwork and camaraderie and stuff like that. But but shows about different types of competition like Kaiji can push a different message. So Kaiji is a show all about gambling, which is always tilted in favor of the house. So it uses the unfair rules of its criminal underworld to highlight things like systemic exploitation, high-risk survival scenarios, vicious cycles, like poverty, depression, all these like darker themes. And because of this, in Kaiju you see a lot more like scheming and backstabbing and distrust. The alliances are unstable. The game is something you're trapped in. Survival is the only prize for winning, as opposed to like being a path to growth or togetherness or glory like in other sports anime. And all this comes from a shift in who makes the rules and who the rules are made to favor. But anyway, in a similar vein to sports, shonen battle series like to build their conflicts out of a complicated battle system, with each series having its own rules about what the character's powers are and aren't able to do. These rules can be universal laws like the law of equivalent exchange in Fullmetal Alchemist, or they can vary from character to character, like how each person in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has their own individual stand power with its own rules that it has to follow. And knowing or discovering what each character can and cannot do becomes the key to the way that the plot advances and the characters interact. And it's very similar to the way that the rules of a sport can make for an interesting conflict just by setting up two teams against each other whose abilities have like specific strengths and weaknesses. And in this arena, one of the best examples is Hunter x Hunter. It is the king of just turning these worlds and these rules and abilities into engaging, immersive character conflicts. Its power system, called Nen, forces characters to choose their specialty. And the more single-minded your dedication, the more you're willing to put on the line for that ability, the more focused your Nen power can become, to the point where it can even kill you if you use that power for anything else. And this makes the abilities just so representative of the character's goals and personalities, which packs the battles with this immense emotional weight. The clashes in these battles just transcend the mechanics and the choreography of the fights and become conflicts of the characters' souls because of the way that these abilities manifest from who they are and what they want and how badly they want it. However, an anime does not need a complicated, fully realized rule system like this in order to make effective use of it in their world. The world doesn't have to be solvable. It doesn't have to be a puzzle. Some worlds just need enough to be understandable, enough to relate to them. Sometimes it's like the vague or hand-wavy rules that are the most effective because they're the most thematically flexible. One rather oddball example is from one of my favorite romance series, Mysterious Girlfriend X. It explores an often overlooked side of romance. It looks at the establishment of mutual trust and consent and boundaries between its characters. And that's something that's often just sort of assumed to be there between characters in a relationship. But this show really digs into what that means to them to establish these things. And the way that it does this is by taking place in a world where if you have like this special bond or compatibility with someone, then you can directly transmit your feelings to each other by tasting each other's drool. I know, it's really weird and gross. It's gross, I know, but like, I like it as this clever way to showcase emotional intimacy in a way that captures just how icky and uncomfortable it can be sometimes. And because it's more of like an emotional thing and the mechanics are kind of vague around it, it really works to represent a lot of different sides of their relationship in just the different situations. But if you want something more concrete than that, like other times, you'll see, usually in sci-fi, you'll see the physical or natural rules rather than the man-made or emotional ones serving as the driving mechanic of the world. So, like Patema Inverted, for example, builds itself around a pair of parallel societies on which gravity operates in opposite directions. And the whole movie is a search for how these characters can like literally find common ground. You know, get it? Because gravity. All right, that was bad. What about Gunbuster? Gunbuster places relativity and space-time dilation at the center of a key decision its characters have to make. While they're journeying into space to fight for the Earth, time passes for them much more slowly than it does here, meaning that everyone they know and love will be long gone by the time that they return. And this forces them to make some very difficult choices. And the payoff for all this is, in the last episode, is just like, it's so good. Like, anyone who's seen Gunbuster, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's amazing. But on the other side of the coin here, Satoshi Kon is a filmmaker who wrings emotional meaning out of the rules of reality by bending and twisting them to mold them into a character's worldview. Whether it's through delusions or movies or dreams or holograms or even Christmas miracles, the world is always in a state of flux. It can be easy to lose track of what's real and what's not, but to the characters, that is what's real. The floor is being pulled out from under the detective's feet. the actress's life story is inseparable from the films that she starred in. It's possibly the most direct way that I've seen to like tie the story's emotional arc to the implications of the world like this. And it's resulted in some truly remarkable films. Like I don't think we will ever see anybody like Satoshi Kon ever again. All right, so that's enough about that. Next up we're going to talk about populating the world. So in addition to like the implications on the story itself, as we've discussed, the most memorable worlds are the ones that exist beyond just the story. Like ask yourself this, if none of the main characters were there, if the main conflict wasn't happening, would the world still go on? Like, who lives in those houses? Who works in those buildings? Like what lives in those woods? How did things get to be the way they are now? Like, answering these kinds of questions can provide context that elevates the story and makes it feel like it matters. Like it has effects that extend beyond just the main cast. And a show with a world that feels alive like this can make you want to come back to it over and over again and relive the time that you spent in that world and discover more about it and the people who live there. And one of the most effective ways to bring a world to life like that is by populating it. So I'm going to start out with creature creation, because creature creation is one element of world building in which animation has a huge advantage over live action media, because it is so much easier to fill a fully animated world with imaginary monsters than to try and integrate all that CG into live action footage. To showcase an anime with some great wildlife, I want to go back to Made in Abyss for a bit. So while a descent into the abyss is pretty daunting on its own, the danger and adventure would not feel nearly as real without the myriad of beautiful and terrifying creatures that lurk within its depths. Look at how terrifying they are. But it's not even just the immediate danger that they pose that brings the most out of this setting. It's the way that each one is so perfectly adapted to fit into its particular layer of the abyss. Like, they've been molded by the abyss to itself to be the way that they are. And this depth of the ecosystem makes the abyss feel like a living, breathing place. Like, our heroes have really dived into the belly of something alive that's evolved in its own universe of flora and fauna over an unfathomable amount of time in an environment we've only just barely begun to scratch the surface of exploring. And so Japan's skill at filling worlds with unique and creative creatures has very, very deep roots. Like you can go probably even farther back than this, but it can be traced all the way back to the ancient like yokai spirits of Japanese folklore, like Shigeru Mizuki's 1960s classic Gegege no Kitaro and its evergreen remakes, I think it's gotten one a decade, have brought these mystical creatures, the yokai, back into popular consciousness in modern times. And it's finally starting to become available in the West after all these years. Like, its most recent reboot is actually available on Crunchyroll, and it really surprised me by being one of my favorite shows from 2018. Like, seriously, it's good. It's not just, it's kind of a kid's show, but like, it's pretty dark. You owe it to yourself to watch at least the Ghost Train episode. And I owe it to myself to finally get back to watching all the 2019 episodes. So Kitaro's yokai adventures are some of the most popular and influential stories in all of anime, and have inspired countless anime to follow, almost certainly including the modern champion of creature-based world building, Pokemans! I doubt there are many kids who grew up in the 90s or later that didn't at some point daydream about living in the Pokemon world, am I right? Like, yeah, sure, the monsters themselves are imaginative and cute and highly marketable, and they're great, I love them. But, like, what makes the world so utterly immersive is how in this show there is absolutely nothing you can't do with Pokemon. They run power plants and hospitals, they're friends and house pets, they're cops and robbers, ninjas and samurai. There are entire family lines and professions dedicated to raising a single type of Pokemon. Like, thanks in part to the sheer number of unique and distinct monsters that inhabit this world, the world of Pokemon is amazingly deeply realized, and that takes it a long way down the road towards the lasting appeal that it's had. Of course, creatures aren't the only thing that anime worlds are full of. Like, there's people too, I guess. Like, One Piece is one of the most popular and longest running anime and manga in history, and I'll probably never manage to catch up on it, but it owes its success in no small part to the cast of literally hundreds of lovable personalities that fill its enormous seascape. Like, that's what keeps people coming back to One Piece. Like, every minor character has their own story to tell, to such an extent that, like, even if Luffy and company fell off the side of the map, like, the world could easily continue on without them. Not that anyone would want that, but it could. Like, One Piece is kind of an exception, though. Like, most shows don't have 800 episodes to work with to build up these characters, and so they try to approach this from a smaller scale. Slice of life shows in particular excel at creating these small but vibrant communities of people to populate their worlds. And there are few better examples of this than Tamako Market, because, oh my goodness, do the townspeople bring the show to life! There are so many lovable side characters living in the market, each with their own jobs and personalities and part to play in the story. It feels like the main characters and you, the viewer, are truly part of a bigger community, which makes Tamako Market feel so warm and welcoming. Tamako is kind of exceptional in having all these characters be like named characters, but it doesn't have to go that far. It can be really cool to just see some randos in the background doing stuff that makes sense in a given setting, or like one-off interactions with characters who have their own life unrelated to the story, or who have like an attitude rooted in the culture of a place. Like, the thing that a world wants to establish is what kind of people live there and what kind of lives do they lead. For example, like a post-apocalyptic world filled with muscle-bound warriors and blade-licking thieves like Fist of the North Star will naturally explore very different types of stories than a post-apocalyptic world like Yokohama Shopping Log, which is occupied by a friendly robot and the dwindling population of humans that visit her coffee shop. A surprising and goofy twist on this whole who lives in the place idea is the way that Astro Fighter Sunred sprinkles in rubber suit tokusatsu monsters amongst its townspeople, pretending as though it's completely normal to say hi to Armored Tiger on a trip to the local grocery store. Like, part of the gag of the show is that the villains are meant to seem like this tight-knit, upstanding family, in contrast to Sunred, the rude lone wolf superhero. And seeing them go about their everyday business helps to establish this trait of the world to show how normal, how much they fit in. And to kind of wrap up this section, my favorite Ghibli movie is Spirited Away, in large part because of the flourishing society that gathers within the bathhouse. Like, we're thrust headfirst along with Chihiro into this vast world that lay just beyond our perception. It's this world of glossy decor, of importance and business, where spirits of all shapes and sizes rush around us every which way. And we're as overwhelmed by our glimpse into the world of spirits as Chihiro is by her glimpse into the world of adulthood. And we can't help but buy into it, to believe in that, because of how vibrantly it's brought to life by the staff and the guests and all these different shapes and sizes of spirits that populate this world, that make it feel like a place that should exist. And that's the power of a well-populated world. A big part of populating the world is building a history or culture for its inhabitants. This is especially important in like sci-fi and fantasy series, which don't necessarily have the same real-world lore and culture to fall back on as, well, the real world. It's certainly not limited to these genres because culture is everywhere. Like, Shirobako, for example, does a great job of establishing its office culture, and like various aspects of Japanese history and culture, of course, naturally play an important role in a huge number of anime that take place there. But like sci-fi and fantasy are just kind of the places that most frequently have to build these things, and so I'm going to be featuring a lot of those in this section. History and culture are just key to building a world that's bigger than the story, because a world with history has a story beyond the one that you're seeing now. And a world with culture gives life and purpose to the people outside the main cast. So, Revolutionary Girl Utena is thoroughly steeped in the traditions and rituals of its school, in particular those surrounding the Rose Duels, in which combatants fight for a claim to the Rose Bride and the power to revolutionize the world. Utena draws on a rich stable of symbolic language and fairy tale iconography, stuff like princes and princesses, ballroom dances, and sword fights. The school just straight up looks like a castle. Like, it draws on these things to lay the groundwork for its themes of agency and power and challenging societal norms. And the sway that these traditions hold, and these fairy tale qualities of the school, make it feel like an old and storied place with a prestige to match its history. And once all that's built up, of course, the show is all about breaking those traditions and hierarchies back down, as you do when you're a revolutionary girl. Speaking of breaking social norms, Time of Eve is a show that walks a line between two distinct sides of a cultural divide to show what happens when these two worlds collide and come together. In the outside world in Time of Eve, robots are treated as property, and they have to wear this identifying ring above their heads to show that they're robots. But within the Time of Eve cafe, robots can turn off these identifying markers. It's almost kind of like an underground, not totally legal speakeasy sort of thing, and there's no discrimination allowed between humans and robots in the walls of this cafe. So when the main characters meet their friends from the cafe in the outside world, the sort of clash of expectations that they encounter prompts them to reflect on the casual othering that their culture had sort of normalized. And hopefully it also gets you, the viewer, to reflect on the casual othering that our culture has normalized. But for a futuristic or dystopian show like From the New World, a key part of the appeal and dramatic tension in the story arises from the question of how the world got to the state that it's in. So we start by simply seeing the culture of the place, austere and full of draconian restrictions and bizarre monsters and superhuman powers, and we slowly discover piece by piece how each of these things got there, why things are this way. And the horror of the unknown gives way to the horror of understanding. So you have this unsettling initial setup for the world, and it slowly reveals over time through these cool mechanisms like ghost stories and legends and things that show that the people of the world don't entirely remember where all of these things came from. And you slowly understand why it's like that and why they're creepy, and it's so good. But it's important not to go overboard with the lore, though. Throwing around too many made-up words and names and other lingo and stuff can make it easy to get lost. There's a balance to be struck here. You want enough to give a taste of the world beyond the story, to establish what the place is like and why in these sort of broad strokes, with maybe a little bit of cool tidbits here and there just to hint at something deeper. But too much of that can be distracting from what's actually important in the story. Another thing that a lot of anime struggle with when building lore, sometimes as a result of having too much of it and having to rush, is how to make it feel natural in the narrative. And they end up resorting to things like momentum-killing, immersion-breaking info dumps. Even From the New World falls victim to this at times. That library episode comes to mind. But Kemono Friends is a show that does a great job of establishing its history through environmental storytelling. So it's based on a mobile game that had actually gone defunct by the time the anime aired, and the show sort of slowly reveals that it takes place not in a savanna like it initially appears, but in a zoo, and that zoo has long since been abandoned and fallen into disrepair, much like the mobile game. And the animal friends that live there, they don't really understand any of this, and so the audience is left to piece it together on their own based on things like the dilapidated signage and the rusty old tour bus and all these other like out of place aspects of this otherwise happy-go-lucky world. And having so many little pieces put together on your own like this can be really fun. I know that's part of what got me invested in the show. But so in contrast to the way that the rest of these shows have sort of created their entire lore out of whole cloth, Girls in Panzer grounds itself to a large degree in like things like real-world military history. To sort of supplement the imagined elements of the show's lore, stuff like high schools on aircraft carriers and recreational tank-based combat sports. I don't think we have any of those. The Girls in Panzer has dedicated staff in charge of like researching the tanks and other military equipment in the show. So things like their strengths and weaknesses in combat, or like the countries that used them, or even things as subtle as like the sounds that they make. Although I guess with tanks that's not really subtle, is it? But the attention to detail brings an extra air of authenticity to the tank battles, and things like tracing the tanks as affiliated countries can kind of enhance the appeal of the show as almost a sort of like tank Olympics. That's probably about as deeply as you'll want to think about the implications of the World War II aesthetics on this one, though. It's mainly there just for fun. But as exciting as like a fantastical setting like this, inspired by real world history, can be, it's also important to remember that culture and history comes from real people in the real world, and they're not just like cool aesthetic details or stereotypes. So Golden Kamuy is a show that builds large parts of its emotional core around the Ainu culture of Hokkaido. And the Ainu are people who are still marginalized and broadly misunderstood today. So mangaka Satoru Noda treads very carefully with his portrayal of them as we meet their villagers, as we learn their customs. Like rather than smother them in victimhood or tokenize his Ainu characters as these like noble mystical people, he collaborated with people intimately familiar with the culture, like who speak the language, and he's gone out of his way to sort of place the specific hunting and camping and cooking traditions in their proper context and give the Ainu characters a variety of different roles to play in the story. And this level of respect for the Ainu and how essential these moments become for like the bonds and divisions that form between the characters adds just such a refreshing level of humanity to this treasure hunt through the snow. All of this world building comes together to create an atmosphere for the show, a general feel that seems to permeate through everything that it does. Like, atmosphere is the air the show breathes, the environment that it creates for the story. An anime without atmosphere is like a planet without an atmosphere. Like, quite frankly, it's lifeless. So After the Rain builds a huge range of atmospheric and thematic weight on the back of one element of its world, the rain. Rain carries such strong ties to the emotional twists and turns of this forbidden romance, I guess, it's almost as if this girl's emotions control the weather. So she's sidelined from the track team by an injury, and this causes her bright and sunny high school years to sort of give way to a more cloudy present. Like it's a storm that she feels so trapped by that she ends up yearning for a world that's years beyond her and ends up falling for her middle-aged boss? Yeah, don't worry, it's actually pretty wholesome, and the show knows better than to lean into that romance. It's all about how the characters help each other through their struggles. And Rain punctuates the moments of her strongest rejections of her youth and the boss's strongest rejections of his age. And it reflects the times when the characters are at their most emotionally vulnerable. Now, the premise might be a bit touchy. Like, as I said, it's handled very delicately, but the atmosphere that it builds with the rain is just, it's tremendous. It's so good. But atmosphere does have a reputation for being like more the domain of these moody, gloomy shows, though. So allow me to slice right through that with Magical Circle Guru Guru, which builds its atmosphere entirely out of fun. Magical Circle Guru Guru is an anime about how childlike innocence and young love are literally magic. So it chooses to center every aspect of its world around nostalgia and childish joy. Guru takes place in a fantasy world modeled mostly after dungeon crawling video games like Dragon Quest, games that many young adults in Japan and the world over grew up playing. So if you're into JRPGs or D&D or anything, this is great. The show's sense of humor primarily consists of like toilet humor and slapstick, the kind of stuff that makes you giggle like a little kid because they said poop. But it's a world where the power-ups are dumb looking and useless and honestly probably cursed. The characters have names like Go Dick and Bark Wiener, and the ultimate light magic spell is called Cool Pose. It's just this like playground humor that's so wholesome and innocent and fun, and it tries with all its heart to bring you back to a time when everything just seemed so much simpler. Bark Wiener. Okay, let's get a bit more serious again. But so my favorite anime of all time is Haibane Renmei, and so much of what makes Haibane work is the care that it puts into crafting its atmosphere. It's a very meditative show, and it's got a message about like self-discovery, and it establishes this tone by leaving a lot up to the interpretation of the audience. It leaves what looks like gaps in its world, like what are the Haibane and why are they there, and what lies beyond the walls that surround the town. Haibane refuses to answer these questions, but it does so to instead build up this meditative, self-reflective atmosphere and direct these questions to the viewer, because they're questions for which each viewer's answer is personal. They're questions that aim to help them come to terms with their own understanding of how they relate to the story. And that's one of the things that I love so much about this show. All right, one more thing I want to showcase. The creation of atmosphere is one of the places in world building where the technical aspects of a show come into the strongest light. Things like the sound design, the music, the visuals. These elements of a show can really work some magic if they're used to their fullest potential. So what I want to focus on now are shows that can bring this to the forefront and explore new ways to use their sound and animation. And this is where it would have been really nice to have some of those clips, especially the audio, like the sound design part, but I'll try to do my best without them. So as a dedicated showcase of just how far one can take the technical side of world building, I'd like to feature Mononoke, a horror anime inspired by the ghost stories of Edo-era Japan. No, this is not Princess Mononoke. Mononoke is just a word that refers to a vengeful spirit, which is where the name Princess Mononoke came from. But anyway, Mononoke, the TV anime, the horror anime, uses its sound and visuals to transport you to another time. The music makes use of traditional Japanese instrumentation, like the shamisen and the bamboo flute, while the sound effects draw heavily on kabuki-style percussion, like the sort of thing that you'd hear in a traditional Japanese stage play. And it's so cool, but easily the show's most stunning feature is its art style, which looks like an ukiyo-e woodblock painting in motion. It's so colorful and unique and beautiful, and the combination of these historical artistic influences with the ghost stories that are rooted in the spiritual tradition of Japan, it takes that cultural element and lends this unrivaled authenticity to the time period. And it's just easily one of the coolest shows I've ever seen. And I briefly mentioned it before, but one last technical aspect that I don't think I've given enough attention is the sound design. Sound design is usually easy to overlook. Like when it's done well, it tends to blend into the background and feel like a natural part of the world. But when a show goes all in on its sound design, it can have some really, truly phenomenal results. And I don't think there's any show that embodies this better than Serial Experiments Lain. Serial Experiments Lain is a show about the internet from the late 1990s, and it's trying to grapple with the implications of this new and strange technology, like the ways that it at once brings us together and tears us apart, and how it offers like the mind a playground with little need for the body. And the uncanny, unsettling sound design amplifies all of this so much. Like, we experience Lane's sort of dissociation with herself through things like the super focus on the echoing sound of chalk on a chalkboard, or how there's these sudden silences where everything just goes completely empty and keeps us on our toes, or there's these murmuring voices or the hum of electrical wires that signals this invisible presence. Like there's another world beyond our perception that runs through these cables surrounding us. And it plays into that horror of the unknown technology so well. But while horror as a genre has an especially mature grasp on sound design, as the last two examples showed us, it's certainly not the only thing that it's used for. I'd like to close today with Girls' Last Tour, which is my favorite anime of the 2010s, like no question. Girls' Last Tour is just this wonderful post-apocalyptic slice of life series with our two main characters taking a scenic adventure through the deserted remnants of a world after humans. But like far from wallowing in this devastation, like Girls' Last Tour looks for the beauty in this emptiness. Like, it's an odd comfort knowing that the world will go on without us needing to be there, but Girls' Last Tour is a show all about finding comfort in the most unlikely of places. And in a world without people, it's the unexpected, incidental sounds that breathe it full of life. The things like the trickle of running water, the hum of a fan, the creak of a metal door. These sounds, they all seem as though they're the way that the world is trying to speak to us. And as the girls travel the world in their Kettenkrad tractor, the rumble of the motor provides this constant companion for them in this otherwise lonely place. And again, it's a strange comfort, but it's one that's very in line with the show's penchant for finding the warmth in cold concrete. So, to wrap things up, we've learned how an anime can use the setting, the culture, and the presentation of its world to give a greater meaning to its story, its characters, its themes, and its atmosphere. I hope you've enjoyed this whirlwind tour of animated worlds, and maybe even found some new anime worlds you want to explore somewhere in this mess. And while there's obviously way more nuance to world building than I could ever hope to cover in an hour, I hope I've at least given you some perspective that you can use to look at your favorite anime and understand why its world means so much to you. And that's it. Thanks for coming. Again, I'm Bokusachi. If you want to find me, I've got my contact info up on the slide, but so please give me some feedback if you want. I love feedback. Tweet at me, put something in the chat, whatever. I'll have a link to the shows I featured up on my blog, and I'll have a link to that on my Twitter. So give me a follow if you want that link, or if you just think that I'm cool and you want to be my friend. I might also see if I can post this on YouTube or something later. I don't know. I don't have an account yet, but if I do that, then I'll link to that on Twitter too. It'll be there. If you want to read more of my stuff, you can check out my blog, Sachikoma, which I am very slow to update. I update it very infrequently. Or you can check out Shooting the Moon, the Symphogear fan shrine I put together during quarantine. It's based on a Symphogear panel I hosted at AWA last year, and it's in the style of one of those like early 2000s GeoCities fan sites. It's awesome. Check it out at shootingthemoon.neocities.org. So once again, thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your Crunchyroll Expo, and I hope you've had a good time.